I'll be reading 1 Chronicles chapter 21, 16 through 17. David looked up and saw the angel of the Lord standing between heaven and earth, with a drawn sword in his hand extended over Jerusalem. Then David and the elders, clothed in sackcloth, fell face down. David said to God, Was it not I who ordered these fighting men to be counted wrong? These are but sheep. What have they done? Lord my God, let your hand fall on me and my family, but do not let this plague remain on your people.
Good morning, everybody. Good job, Jax. I noticed that Jax was the one reading that, and then I tried to shorten it, and Cole said, no, he's been practicing, so very good job. This is the part in our series where we get to Chronicles, and you start reading Chronicles, and you think, didn't I just read this? And then I did some digging in that. I tried to figure out, what is the purpose of this? It's because, as far as we can tell, 1st and 2nd Chronicles is in the wrong place in our Bibles. In the Hebrew Bibles, it's the very last book of the Old Testament. But for us, it's kind of stuck in the middle there with our history section. And that's why we don't read it. We get through Samuel, we get through the Kings, we get to Chronicles. It begins with 9 chapters of genealogy. 9 chapters. And we think, I'm not reading that. So we skip it. And then we get to chapter 10 and we think, well, this is the same as 1 Samuel. I just read this. Then you get to 2 Chronicles. It's the same as 1st and 2nd Kings. And we think, I just read all this. So we just skip it. And we go straight to the next book, which is Ezra. And so it is a lot of stories that we just read, but it's recorded for a very different purpose. Kings is written during the time that the Israelites are in exile. And it's almost like Kings is trying to say, this is how we got here. It's because of our sin, because of our idolatry. Chronicles, however, is written after they return from exile back to Israel, and they're trying to rebuild their nation. They're looking at what things from our past should we get rid of? What things should we keep? Maybe they're even asking questions like, what hope is there for us? And so Chronicles makes this claim over and over again that this is off. There we go. Chronicles claims that when kings, specifically the sons of David, listen to God's voice and they center the kingdom of Israel around the priesthood, God's people are given rest and they're given peace. And the rest of the book is trying to prove that point. The rest of 2nd Chronicles is trying to prove that with the kings of Judah. 1st Chronicles is all about David, and the 2nd Chronicles starts with Solomon. But think about this just for a moment, right? Instead of having Chronicles right here, imagine that it is the last book that you read of the Old Testament. It's the last thing you read before Matthew, setting up the hope of a future king like David, which is, of course, we know, fulfilled in Jesus. But I think that's what the author of Chronicles is trying to do. He's trying to renew Israel's hope that God isn't done with them yet. Okay? This is something that I want to try and clarify. I didn't really have a good spot for this, so I figured right here at the beginning is a good time. When I say that we're centering on the priesthood, I'm not talking about centering on the temple. okay? Specifically on the priesthood and all of the symbolism that goes with it, right? The temple is good, but it's just a symbol of what God truly desires. If the symbol becomes the focus, it overshadows the real thing that you need to be seeing, right? Which is listening to God, which is the forgiveness of sins and restoring that relationship, right? And we see this very clearly, fast forward all the way to the New Testament. That's exactly what the people were focusing on when Jesus came, right? The temple was the focal point at that time. So much so they couldn't see the reality that the temple pointed to was standing right in front of them. Now, I know the genealogy isn't terribly exciting, but there's something very interesting happening with this genealogy. Anytime the Bible has genealogy, a lot of care and effort has gone into the order that it's put in, and Chronicles is no different. It traces all of Israel's history all the way from Adam to post-exile, right? So several centuries worth of history put into this genealogy. But they are emphasizing two very specific lines: the line of David, which they are tracing the Messianic king, and the line of Aaron, which is the priesthood, right? And so the reason that they're tracing these lines is because the hope is that the Messiah will come and he will build a new priesthood, a new temple system, right? And so this is a Bible word you hear if you do a lot of if you watch a lot of Bible Project and stuff like that, you'll come across this word, this form of writing that the Hebrews do. It's called a chiasm, or a chiastic structure. Johnny and I argue about what it's actually supposed to be called, but that's beside the point. But you have this structure where sometimes you see it as like half of an X, sometimes you see it as like a mountain, but it's the same idea both ways. This chiasm is there's a matching section on parallel sides, right? And so you can find where these things kind of match up. It's not always perfect. It's not always easy to spot. But when you see that structure, when you see something like that, what they're trying to get you to focus on is whatever's in the middle, right? For us, we would probably put the most important thing at the beginning or at the end. But for the Hebrews, it was definitely right in the middle, the peak of the mountain, right? And so you look at the genealogy. We're not going to go through in great detail, but I do want to point out this chiasm to you. So it starts with Adam all the way back. Oh, that is so tiny. I did not test how this would look on the big screen, but we're going to go for it. It begins with Adam all the way back to the beginning, Israel's history before there ever was a king or a kingdom. And then at the end, the parallel section is at the end of chapter 9, which again, very long genealogy. It's the people who came back to Israel after the exile, after the kingdom period. So you've got pre- and post-kingdom people on either side of this first section. And then you've got the next section. You've got the tribe of Judah, which is David's tribe. And then on the parallel side, you've got the tribe of Benjamin, which is Saul's tribe. The next section, you've got all the other tribes, and it doesn't match up perfectly. It's not like 5 and 5 or anything like that. But they're definitely talking about the other tribes. But then at the very top, you have the tribe of Levi. And in the middle of Levi, at the peak of this genealogy, chapter 6, verses 31 through 32, you have these singing priests and temple musicians, right? And so this says, 1 Chronicles 6, 31 and 32, these are the men David put in charge of the music in the house of the Lord after the ark came to rest there. They ministered with music before the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, until Solomon built the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. They performed their duties according to the regulations laid down for them. So right there at the peak, the most important thing in this genealogy is this singing priests and temple musicians, right? And that brings us to the question, why is this so important? Why is this the most important thing in the genealogy? Well, Chronicles says that this is how you get guidance from God, right? The singers are called prophets. Their singing is called prophecy. And in Chronicles and in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, kings rise or fall in Israel based on their response to God's word in the mouth of prophets. This is why Chronicles is so focused on the priesthood, because to them, this is how you listen to God's voice. And the genealogy tells a story of Israel's history with prophets singing the direction and word of the Lord, and kings listening to it right at the center. And so all of this is to show you that Israel's history has always been bent towards the priesthood, or at least it was supposed to be, right? And they're presenting this ideal of how Israel should structure itself going forward, okay? To go even further into this, if you think back to Exodus and Numbers, when they would organize their camp, the tabernacle was always placed right at the center. And then all the other tribes were placed around it in circles, right? And the Levites were the closest ones. I think in Numbers it says that the Levites are the buffer, right? They're the ones that kind of protect everybody else from God's wrath, from getting too close to the tabernacle, right? The Levites are the ones that are responsible for caring for the tabernacle and also transporting the tabernacle. In Exodus, they have this thing called the tent of meeting. Eventually, the tabernacle was also called the tent of meeting. But the tent of meeting had the same purpose, right? Moses met with God face to face. Why? To hear his voice, to receive instruction. And the pillar of fire or the pillar of cloud that rests on it to show God's presence in the tent, before it was that, it was a guide in the wilderness. So giving guidance to Israel, particularly to the kings, is one of the first reasons for the tabernacle to have even existed, and later the temple as well. So the purpose of these singing priests is not just to offer thanks, not just to worship and praise, which is what I think of when I think of singing, probably what you think of as well. And that's probably also happening, right? But these priests represent the voice of God, his guidance, his direction. The priests represent the people before God, and they also represent God before the people. And so when David, you'll see it throughout 1st and 2nd Samuel, you also see it in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, when he goes to ask God, should we attack them or not? He's going to these singing priests, right? He doesn't just have a quiet moment in his study. He goes to the tent. He goes to the ark. He presents the question before God, and the answer comes to him from these singers. So the priesthood is at the center because good kings listen to God's voice and they obey it. Now think about that. This is how it was all set up. But after being exiled for a couple of decades, being brought back to the promised land, there are certain things they might have felt needed some reworking, some revamping, right? For example, they might have thought, David was a good king, but he did mess up pretty bad. And all of his sons were pretty terrible kings. In fact, David's sons caused their exile. Maybe we don't need a son of David on the throne, right? Or maybe they framed it in a different way. Maybe they thought the promise God gave to David doesn't apply to us anymore because we've damaged the relationship too much. Or maybe they started thinking about the temple, right? It was very beautiful, but it got destroyed, right? The temple didn't save us. Having God's presence among us right in the center of everything, it didn't save us from exile. It didn't save us from oppression. Do we really need another one? Is it that important? And the author of Chronicles comes along and he says, yes, they're extremely important. He says, sit down, kid. I'm going to tell you the history of our people. Because Chronicles isn't just repeat information from 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. It's attempting to do an entire history of Israel from Adam all the way to post-exile. But it's doing so with a very specific purpose in mind. And so Chronicles doesn't just repeat stories we've heard, but they do it to stress the importance and the goodness of these things that maybe people have forgotten, or maybe that people think they don't apply to me anymore. They don't apply to Israel. And so 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings are historical book reports, right? They're the good, the bad, and the ugly. They're saying exile was our fault and we need to do better. However, Chronicles is more like a persuasive argument, or maybe a sermon, right? Our hope for the future is rooted in the past. These promises still apply. These things still matter. And so what Chronicles does is, yes, it tells stories that we've read, but they present this idealized version of David and Solomon. This is what you find when you search idealized in Google Images. So that's why it's here. But it sets David and Solomon up as the ideal king and the ideal kingdom of Israel for them to strive for. And your thought right now is probably the same thought that I had, but David and Solomon weren't ideal. They weren't perfect. They made so many mistakes. And Chronicles isn't ignorant of that, right? But instead of focusing on their mistakes, which is what the book of 1st Kings did, the author wants people to remember, no, hey, rewind the clock. They weren't all bad. Yes, they made mistakes, but they did do some good. When David was faithful, we had peace. We had wealth. God was with us, and we can get back to that because God's promise to David still applies. So Chronicles wants to show us what God intended Israel to be, a light to the nations. Right? And we'll see that very clearly when we get to Solomon's reign. But the theme of Chronicles, what the author is practically begging you to do is listen to the voice of God. Center the nation of Israel around the priesthood. When they do, they get rest and they get peace. And not only does Israel get rest and peace, but the nations around Israel get rest and peace also. When David does that, he and Israel are blessed. When he doesn't, Israel begins to crumble. And almost like proof of the concept, this is the first story you read when you get done with 9 chapters of genealogy. In chapter 10, chapter 10, it retells the story of King Saul's death from the end of 1 Samuel. And this is like proof of the claim that he's making, right? Verse 13 and 14 tell us Saul died because he didn't keep the word of the Lord. He consulted a medium, a necromancer. He did not inquire of the Lord. So through this battle with the Philistines, the Lord put him to death, and he turned the kingdom over to David. You know, David gets this idealized version, but Saul doesn't get any of that in Chronicles. The big theme in Chronicles, listening to the Lord leads to rest and peace, but not listening leads to death. The first story that you get in Chronicles is about a king who doesn't do it right, and he self-destructs, and he dies. And the chronicler believes the fastest way to kill your nation is not to listen to God. And so a lot of the rest of the stories in 1 Chronicles are dealing with David, and I know we've spent a lot of time in this series talking about David. But there's 2 stories that I want to focus on in David that we haven't got to talk about yet. There are subtle differences in the stories as well. This is also so small. Y'all are not going to be able to read this. This is the promise that God gave to David in 2 Samuel 7, which was the focus of our 2 Samuel lesson. This is what it reads in 1 Chronicles. There are very subtle differences. The main thing I want you to see, if you can read that, the last verse, Second Samuel makes it sound like it could possibly be fulfilled in Solomon, but Chronicles, with the benefit of hindsight, it makes it clear it's not David who fulfilled this promise. It's not even Solomon who fulfilled this promise, but he's coming, right? And when he does, he will be a king like David. And so these stories of David from the past sustain the hope for the future. Even the stories about David's failures, which is what I want to focus on for Chronicles, they only mention 2 of David's failures, and it's probably not the ones that you're thinking of. One of the first things David does when he becomes king is that he goes and conquers Jerusalem. The Jebusites are there, and he overtakes them, and he makes Israel's capital Jerusalem. He makes this the capital city, which is something Saul never bothered to do, right? And now that it's the capital city, he wants to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. He wants it to make it the religious capital of Israel as well. The Ark of the Covenant is back in Gibeon where Saul left it. He never bothered to go and get it or send anybody after it. So David brings it to Jerusalem. And this is a failure of David's because he treats the Ark like a military conquest. You know, he parades it back into Israel like a trophy carried on a cart, which becomes important in the next part of the story. It's being carried on this cart. The oxen stumble, the cart starts to sway, the ark is about to fall out, and a man reaches out to try and catch it, to stop it from falling on the ground. And to punctuate the point that approaching God's holiness in an unholy way or in an unclean way is dangerous, the man who touches the ark dies. And you might think, well, that's kind of harsh. He was trying to help. Well, if you go back and look at how the ark is supposed to be transported, it was never supposed to be on a cart. It was never supposed to be carried this way. It was supposed to be carried by the Levites, right? So this man dies, and David is responsible for that. But what makes David different is how he responds to this failure. He doesn't get mad at God. He repents. He receives forgiveness. Here's the important part. He studies the Torah, and he comes back to take the ark to Jerusalem, but this time it's carried by Levites the way it was supposed to be, which again shows the importance of the priests. So why does David want the ark closer to him? It's very simple. It's kind of in line with why he wants to build the temple. It all stems from wanting to be closer to God so we can ask God more questions, so we can receive more guidance. The way it was, he would have to go to the ark in Gibeon. It was a couple days' journey. Every time he wanted to speak to God or ask God for guidance, he would have to make this several-day journey and then several days' journey back. But this is why David is such a good king, is because he wants to hear from God. He wants guidance. He wants it closer so he can do it more often. At least that's one of the reasons. I don't know if that's the main reason. But that's what makes David such a good king. However, then you get to chapter 21. And this is what Jax read a little bit earlier. David's second failure, he takes a census of his fighting men. Chronicles says that Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to do this. And you're probably thinking, why is that wrong? Because I know there were other censuses in the Bible, so what's the big deal about this one? That was like the whole theme of the book of Numbers, was that God wanted them to take a census. But in Chronicles, the theme is listening to God, centering on the priesthood. And by taking the census, you notice who specifically he's looking for are the fighting men. He's not centering on the priesthood. He's centering on military might, on human strength. He's centering the nation on his military. And this is how you know it's a really bad idea, right? David decides he's going to do this. He tells Joab, hey, this is what I'm going to do. And Joab is the one who's like, David, that's a terrible idea. You know, usually it was the other way around, but this time David talks Joab into doing this thing. And so God punishes David for doing this, right? David is given his choice of 3 different consequences. 3 years of famine, 3 months of being swept away by enemies, which David knows exactly what that's like, or 3 days of a plague. And the way the plague is described is the angel of the Lord ravaging every part of Israel. So David chooses the plague. And he says, I don't want to be at the mercy of man. I want to be at the mercy of God. God's mercy is greater than human mercy. But this plague still killed 70,000 people in Israel in 3 days. You get to chapter 21, verse 16 and 17. This is what Jax read earlier. And now you've kind of got the context for why this is such a big deal. David looked up and saw the angel of the Lord standing between heaven and earth with a drawn sword in his hand extended over Jerusalem. David and the elders, clothed in sackcloth, fell face down. David said to God, was it not I who ordered the fighting men to be counted? I, the shepherd, have sinned and done wrong, but these are but sheep. What have they done? Lord my God, let your hand fall on me and my family. Do not let this plague remain on your people. Just to paint this abundantly clear, you have a king who calls himself a shepherd, laying down his life for his sheep. Hopefully that reminds you of somebody. And so the angel tells David, he ends up standing in a threshing floor. This threshing floor is a guy by the name of Araunah the Jebusite. The Jebusites were the people that were overthrown, that were kicked out of Jerusalem. But here's this guy with a threshing floor right here next to Jerusalem. And this is where the angel stands. David buys the threshing floor from him. He insists on paying full price. He says, I won't sacrifice a burnt offering that costs me nothing. And in this place, David sacrifices. He calls on the Lord. The Lord answers him with fire from heaven, and the angel takes his sword and sheaths it. Okay. Other than being a cool story, what's the point? Why is this important? Why are we spending so much time on this? Because this spot on Araunah the Jebusite's threshing floor is the spot where the temple is built. Did y'all know that? This place of substitution, of sacrifice, the nation is supposed to center itself around. When you have a king willing to sacrifice himself for the good of his people, that's what you build your life around. Sound like anybody we know? But it goes deeper. Because as I was researching this, I found out Araunah's threshing floor used to go by a different name. Mount Moriah. The same place that Abraham was supposed to sacrifice his son and God stopped him. Is the same place that David offered himself and God stops him too. This type of love and self-sacrifice has always been important to God's people. We're going to fast forward again. Centuries later, when Jesus walks the grounds of Herod's temple, the temple has been rebuilt and Herod made a bunch of additions to it, so it's just called Herod's temple. It's still on Mount Moriah. Eventually, Jesus is silenced. He's sentenced to death. He's taken outside the city walls to a hill called Golgotha, the place of the skull. Some people believe that this is the spot where David brought Goliath's skull, and that's why it's called Golgotha. But the point is that this is the spot where Jesus is crucified. Anybody want to take a guess where Golgotha is? It's not the exact same place, but it's pretty close. It's part of the same mountain range, but it is outside the city walls. Okay, so just to make sure that we're all on the same page, make this absolutely clear. The spot where Abraham almost sacrificed his son, the spot where David almost sacrificed himself, is near the spot where God does sacrifice his son and himself. So again, I say, when you have a king willing to sacrifice himself for the good of his people, that's where you should build your life around. But just like he always does, Jesus takes this a step even further. Because David was willing to die for his own sins, his own mistakes, to save Israel. Jesus died for others' mistakes, not having any of his own, and not just for Israel, for the whole world. We all know this verse. We can quote it, but just for a second in this context, let it marinate. John 3:16 and verse 17. For God so loved the world, not just Israel, that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. And so Chronicles kind of closes with David passing the torch to Solomon. And these stories aren't really found in 2 Samuel. David reaffirms the promises that God has made to him that will be partially fulfilled in his son Solomon. David hands over the plans that he made for the temple to his son Solomon, just like Moses passed the torch to Joshua. Now David passes it to Solomon. In fact, it's so similar, it's kind of uncanny. God gave Moses the plans for the tabernacle. Now God gives the plans for the temple to David. However, Moses couldn't enter the promised land, so he gives the reins to Joshua, and now David can't build the temple, so he passes it to Solomon. David gives this final address to Israel, very similar to Deuteronomy. He gives encouragement for Solomon. It's even very similar words that Moses spoke to Joshua. This is 1 Chronicles 28:20. David also said to Solomon his son, "Be strong and courageous and do the work. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord God, my God, is with you. He will not fail you or forsake you until all the work for the service of the temple of the Lord is finished." And so Chronicles is written after Israel returned from exile. It looks into their history. It attempts to renew hope for the future. How do you rebuild a nation after you've been exiled? How do you prevent the same mistakes from happening again? What stories from our founding fathers should we listen to? Which ones should we ignore? Can we trust David's line? Can we trust the temple? These kind of seem like a mixed bag in our history. So the chronicler is writing to these people, particularly the leaders, and he says, okay, let me teach you what was good about our founding fathers so we can copy their successes and avoid their mistakes. But it all comes down to these three things. This is the thing that's repeated the most throughout Chronicles. Listen to God, center the nation on the priesthood, and God will give them rest and peace. And it's easy to look at that and think, well, that sounds really great, but I don't know how that applies to me, because things are very different for us in the New Testament. And we don't necessarily have a priesthood, or at least not the same one that they do, but we do have something. We have 1 Peter 2:9. Peter says this, "You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light." What he's trying to say is that we are priests now, right? It's a completely different system, but the message is the same. We don't make sacrifices for the people. We point them to Jesus' sacrifice for forgiveness of sins. And what about the rest? What about the peace that was offered? Well, this is what Jesus says. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And I want to close by asking this question. If we centered our lives on forgiveness, on selflessness, how might that affect the nations around us? At this time, we're going to offer an invitation. If there's anything that we can do for you, if you need prayers, if you want to be baptized, we'll take care of that right here, right now. Please come now as we stand and as we sing.